It is now my pleasure to turn today's program over to Radhika Fox, CEO of the U.S. Water Alliance. Radhika, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madison, and good morning or good afternoon to everybody, depending on where you're calling from. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Northwest Vision for 2040 Water Infrastructure, Innovative Pathways, Smarter Spending, Better Outcomes. I wanted to begin by first thanking CH2M for hosting today's webinar and for inviting the U.S. Water Alliance to participate. We have partnered with CH2M for many years. They are part of our leader circle, and just through all of those partnerships have really appreciate the organization as a leader both in innovative approaches to project design and delivery and for their tremendous commitment to sustainable water management. So let me introduce the topic that we're going to talk about today, and then we'll get started with a great lineup of speakers. In a region that is so water abundant, the challenges that impact our water systems are, often taken for granted. Certainly this can be the case in the Pacific Northwest. But through this report, it's thrilling to see that water is one of the 5 big goals for the region and that there's such robust cross-sector dialogue around the solutions. For those of you who may not be familiar with the U.S. Water Alliance, we're a national nonprofit that's committed to securing a sustainable water future for all by advancing One Water programs and policies. We really believe at the Alliance that America's water future is at a crossroads. On the one hand, we're experiencing challenges like we've never seen before, whether it's drought, flooding, water contamination. But on the other hand, we also have stewards, like the ones you're about to hear from today, that are forging transformative solutions. For us, at the Alliance, the One Water movement is really about creating partnerships, partnerships between utility managers, public officials, farmers, riverkeepers, businesses, philanthropy. It goes on, because we really believe that we can get farther when we work together. And it's our view, really, that the Northwest Vision for 2040 Water Infrastructure Report is exactly about that. It's tremendously exciting. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I really encourage you to do so. It's the first attempt to construct a regional shared vision for the future of water infrastructure in the Northwest. It really recognizes that the way we did infrastructure investment in the past will not be enough to address the water challenges that we face in the future. And so it presents a new approach for 21st century infrastructure that relies on long-term planning, innovative tools, and systems integration to support more sustainable water management. And the timing for this report could not be better. Even though the region is reaching a tipping point for water and wastewater investment needs, what you will see through this webinar is that the Pacific Northwest has all the ingredients for success. A culture and a public that demands more sustainable and resilient approaches, a shared visionary roadmap to chart that course, which you're just about to hear from Reese on, and the leadership in place to lead the way. And again, many of those leaders you'll hear from during the webinar. So as far as our agenda for our time together, we're first going to hear from Reese Roth, who is the author of this report. He'll kick off by sharing some of the key recommendations, and then we'll have a respondent session with some leaders in the region. So with that, let me introduce Reese. Reese is the director of the Center for Sustainable Infrastructure at Evergreen State College. After 15 years of running the nonprofit group Climate Solutions, Reese founded CSI to help bring innovation, new tools, sustainability excellence to infrastructure planning and investment in the Pacific Northwest. So I'm going to turn the reins over to you, Reese. Thank you.
Thanks, Radhika. Really appreciate it. And let me assure everyone, first off, that I am definitely not James Comey. And while there is a lot of national political theatrics absorbing a lot of attention in the country right now, let's give a little thanks for our water infrastructure, which is working for us day in and day out really well. And let's thank all those heroes that are doing the work of keeping these systems working, because these systems are absolutely essential for our communities. And the reality is that most of us are pretty oblivious to the vast network of pipes and pumps and filtration facilities and treatment plants that are running throughout our community. We turn on the tap or the shower, flush the toilet, we hop the water that's streaming into the stormwater drain when we're dashing out to the car in the rain. And, you know, even though we don't pay a lot of attention to water infrastructure, quality, affordable infrastructure is vital for any community to thrive. Every person, every family, every business needs water and water services every day. We need an uninterrupted flow of clean water. We need the wastewater that we create to be processed, to protect public health. We need to prevent local flooding and big storms. Next slide, please. So this Northwest Vision for 2040 Water Infrastructure is the second in the Center for Sustainable Infrastructure's 5 Big Goals for 2040 series. And the premise is basically that we're going to be spending several $billions a year, every year, on our infrastructure systems. And these are long-term investments. They're typically investments in facilities that are going to be around for 25, 30, 50 years or more. So they're generational investments. But when we look out to 2040, we see that right now technology is changing dramatically. Demographics are changing. Environmental and health pressures are growing. So if we can align on a vision for how these systems can work differently and better in 2040, then we can screen our near-term investments this year, next year, and the next year, and ask if they're getting us where we want to go. So that the design question for this report boils down to how can Oregon and Washington develop one of the most sustainable, resilient, and affordable water infrastructure systems in the world, spanning water supply, wastewater, stormwater, and flood infrastructure. Next slide, please. So in constructing this vision, it was developed essentially in consultation with over 50 water sector leaders along the West Coast, utility executives, design innovators, civil engineers, nonprofit leaders, tribal CEOs and presidents, equity advocates. And the challenge was really to synthesize their insights into something resembling a shared vision that everybody could kind of get behind for 2040 water infrastructure in the Northwest. Again, spanning the water supply, wastewater, stormwater, flood control silos. We put together a solid draft of that, and then we had a 20-member executive review team provide detailed feedback on that, which was extraordinarily valuable in helping us move towards something resembling a shared vision. So a key finding is that our utilities face some really significant challenges looking forward. And it's really important that we have financially healthy utilities. We established utilities last century, for the most part, to supply these essential water services reliably, affordably, and equitably for everybody, rich, poor, big, small, every neighborhood, every color. Utilities are great. Utilities are vitally important, but they're in a time of tremendous change and reinvention. We have disruptive efficiency, which basically means that more people are using less water. Conservation is great, but utility revenues are, in many cases, tied to the water volume sold. So even though conservation is great for the overall system, it doesn't directly reduce the cost of the pipes and the pumps and filtration and treatment infrastructure. So it creates a revenue challenge for utilities. Utilities also face really aging infrastructure. A lot of our infrastructure was built 40 years ago, up to 100 years ago, and it's long in the tooth. And the National Infrastructure Advisory Council estimates that we're seeing, because of aging infrastructure, about 250,000 water main breaks in the country each year, 25,000 to 75,000 sewage plant overflows. So that aging infrastructure is a key challenge. Another is that we have a new portfolio of solutions. We've got several key categories of 21st century solutions that are now available to water infrastructure planners, but they're pretty different from the centralized solutions that make up the civil engineer's playbook that most longtime utility staff were trained in 30 to 40 years ago. And then another challenge, water infrastructure isn't just vulnerable to the decay of old age. A Cascadia subduction zone earthquake, I think it's fair to say it could be potentially catastrophic. And then you have climate change rejiggering the hydrological patterns that were assumed to be stationary when we built and sized and designed our water infrastructure. Next slide. So the new solutions portfolio, we manage and operate and invest in these water infrastructure systems separately with separate utilities providing fresh water, managing wastewater, managing stormwater, flood control, each with their own set of regulatory drivers and regulators. But as Radhika was describing, one molecule of water that falls as rain then becomes stormwater and feeds the water body or groundwater that supplies water for our homes and businesses and then enters the wastewater system. It's really one water. So in 2040, we'll manage these systems in a much more integrated and holistic way. We'll have networks of micro-infrastructure blended in with the legacy systems. Micro-infrastructure systems harvest, store, and utilize rainfall at the home or building level or at the district or neighborhood scale. And there are technologies now to purify the water on site and to keep water out of the storm system in big storms. And one advantage of these smaller systems is that they can be deployed in low-cost, low-risk chunks compared to traditional centralized facilities. But that will require new partnerships between utilities and companies and green builders and customers in which utilities might actually pay these parties for the value that these systems deliver to the larger system. Green infrastructure, it's about rebuilding and protecting natural systems with soils, plants, trees, wetlands, in ways that can actually reduce the burden on our centralized systems at lower cost. And green infrastructure does that by absorbing, retaining, infiltrating, filtering water flows, and it too can be deployed in small, low-risk chunks and with multiple benefits for the community. Some keys to success: integrating across supply, treatment, and stormwater. We've talked about that. Practicing the new investment discipline. Nationally, our water and wastewater utilities are spending something on the order of $100 billion a year. So the question is, how do we get the most long-term community value from this spending? So there are new tools for the new investment discipline that are emerging: value planning, sustainable asset management. Basically, it boils down to screening our year-to-year investments more rigorously by spending a little more upfront, early stage in advanced project and system planning in order to save a lot more when we actually do build. Finally, forging cost-share partnerships for multi-benefit projects. Smartest solutions do more than one thing and deliver multiple value streams. And that creates opportunities to bring in other investors in addition to the utility, to buy other value streams: health investors, fish investors, wildlife investors, carbon, energy efficiency investors. None of this is particularly easy, but it's important. So the report concludes with top 5 things for utilities to do and for policymakers to do. I won't go into those kind of details now, but we are going to be passing the torch of leadership to a new generation over the next decade in the water infrastructure world. Some of the leading lights currently, the leading innovators in our region are on the call today. So I want to hand it back to Radhika so we can hear from them.
Thanks, Reese, for that great presentation. So to kick off our respondent session, we have Chuck Clarke, who is the CEO of the Cascade Water Alliance. But Chuck is really, I would say, a water legend in the Pacific Northwest, has worn many important hats in water, from being the director of the Seattle Public Utilities Commission, served as one of Seattle's deputy mayors, the EPA regional administrator, and now as the CEO of the Cascade Water Alliance. He oversees a municipal corporation of 5 cities and 2 water and sewer districts that provide water to over 300,000 residents and 20,000 businesses in northern Washington. And Chuck, we're also so thrilled that the Cascade Water Alliance is one of the new members of the U.S. Water Alliance. So we're really glad that you've joined your alliance has joined our alliance's family. So let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Radhika. And for those that don't pay attention to the work that the Alliance is doing, I would really encourage you to do that. We have been active participants, and I think it's leading to a good outcome nationally. Secondly, thank you to Reese and the work of the Center in taking a look to the future on how to deal with infrastructure in a sustainable way. I think one of the challenges is if you're going to talk about sustainable infrastructure, you really need to have a sustainable utility going forward. If your utility isn't sustainable, then you're not going to be able to even address the issues of sustainable infrastructure. So what I'm going to do is give you what I think are the 10 key attributes for a sustainable utility when I look forward over the next 20 or 30 years and out to a time frame of 2040. First, do you have a dynamic supply and demand forecasting model and process in place? If you do not have a dynamic forecasting model, you are going to have a significant problem as you look to the future. The one thing we know about every water supply forecast is the day that it's done, it's wrong. And if it's wrong, then you need to be dynamic enough to keep examining it year after year to make sure that you are understanding what's happening both from a supply and demand perspective. Secondly, are you planning on a long-term horizon, at least 50 years? If you do not have a long-term planning horizon, you're optimizing in the short run, which could be sub-optimizing in the long run. And although history can be helpful as you look back, it is not always predictive, and so you must be looking to the future, not backward to the past, and I think that's critical when you start taking a look at planning. Third, do you have an asset management program in place which incorporates basically triple bottom line? Are you looking at environmental, social, and economic impacts? Do you have a full understanding of the conditions of your assets? A lot of the discussion about the need for asset investment is not based on condition, but based rather on planning models that estimate condition. And so the more you can do for knowing the condition of your assets, the better decisions you can make. Do you understand the risk of asset failure, the consequence of failure of the individual assets, and do you have a priority plan in place for replacement or repair? Fourth, do you have a program in place to deal with affordability? For many, and particularly urban jurisdictions, affordability is becoming critical, particularly to low-income customers who are struggling more and more. We're talking about water today, but when you take a look at a bill for a low-income customer, it could be, when you figure water and electricity and garbage and wastewater, all of a sudden it approaches or exceeds 10% of their income. That's not a problem for your high-income customers, but it is a huge problem for your low-income customers, and going forward, affordability is going to be a key component. Fifth, do you understand and can you ensure equitable delivery of service? Are you assessing your services periodically to make sure you're providing the same service across your jurisdiction? At Seattle, we did an assessment. We found we weren't in at least one area, and we needed to address that. So, are you assuring equity to all your customer base? Sixth, have you figured out how to have revenue certainty and stability? Do you understand your revenue model? Particularly in the last 10 years, we were all trying to give basically signals on the demand side by volume pricing, which was great when demand was going up. As demand started to shrink, now all of a sudden with fixed costs and variable revenue, utilities started struggling to make enough revenue to survive. And if you do not have revenue to survive on, you're not going to be able to deal with sustainable infrastructure going forward. Seventh, Do you understand intergenerational equity? And do you understand how much debt financing you should be doing versus non-debt financing? If you fund everything in cash, you're putting your current customers at risk and bearing the full burden of every investment you make. If you put too much in debt, you're making all your future customers pay too much for the infrastructure or investments you're making. Do you know how to find the right balance between current customers and future customers so there's a fairness in how you are financing all the investments that you're making? Eighth, are you using all water resources and sources optimally? And I think Reese talked about that, but we're talking molecules of water. Have you figured out how to integrate stormwater, wastewater, and water planning together and making better decisions on a regional basis? Ninth, and this is getting more and more critical, do you have a workforce plan in place not only on succession, as we see an aging workforce in many utilities, but also on demographic changes to the workforce? And are you, as a utility, prepared to deal with different demographics in incoming workforce? Many more people of color, many more women, people with disabilities. You need to be able and be prepared to deal with that changing nature of a workforce, or you're not going to have a sustainable utility. And then finally, do you have a plan in place to deal with disruptive events? They could be short-term events. We could have an earthquake this afternoon. We can have an earthquake tomorrow. We may not have one for 20 years, but are you prepared to deal with that? The same with asset failure, significant asset failure. Are you ready? Water quality events. All you have to do is watch what's gone on in Flint. Are you prepared to deal with that? Drought and climate change. Those are all issues on the negative side. On the positive side, can you address potential partnerships and do it quickly enough if they become available to you? It is critical to long-term success to not deal with yourselves in a silo or in a vacuum, but rather expand your thinking on how to deal with issues, and that could include a number of partnerships, which could include not only other public entities, if you're a public utility, but the private sector in figuring out how to deal with these. I think all of these are critical attributes as you look to the future, and are critical if you really want to have a sustainable utility and a sustainable infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck, for those great remarks. I want to now turn it over to Liz Kelly, who's a Vice President at CH2M. She brings over 20 years of experience in water, wastewater, and drainage utility management, and works with a number of water districts, municipalities, utilities, both in the Pacific Northwest and around the country. So thank you so much for joining us, Liz.
Great. Thank you so much, Radhika. And I also want to thank Chuck. And by the way, the 10-point agenda that Chuck outlined is a real one. It's very important for creation of a strong foundation for an organization, and Chuck is the real deal. When he runs organization, he makes sure these things happen. So it's also a very challenging one. Some smaller or medium-sized organizations may have a little bit of difficulty getting all of those things in place, but Chuck, you create a great model for people to turn to, and there's a lot of good examples out there about how the things that you mentioned are being done in organizations. So what I have for you today is two major points of emphasis, and I'll try to keep this simple, with the first one being that when it comes to aging infrastructure, we have to take better care of what we've already got in operations, the infrastructure we've already got in the ground. In our industry, water, wastewater, stormwater, actually also transportation and facilities, we're on a learning curve with optimal asset management, with really being able to take good care of infrastructure we've already got in the ground. And based on my experience over the last 25 years, and most recently the last 4 years as a consultant, there really are ways we can be better maintaining and making smarter decisions regarding existing infrastructure, the ways we operate, maintain, how we make decisions about asset renewal and rehabilitation. And with this, we can reduce the cost of owning assets, and we can improve services, and we can also postpone those big dollar replacement decisions. And by doing that, it frees up additional dollars and resources to make sure we're being smart about those new assets we're sure we need. So to make this a little bit more concrete, we have a lot of organizations in our industry that are still maintaining their assets in a very reactive way. And we want to switch that to become more planned and proactive with our maintenance activities in order to reduce costs and improve services. For example, there are ways we can be optimizing that preventative maintenance. We can be doing reliability-centered maintenance. So and to close on this first point of emphasis, it's just because it's old doesn't mean it needs to be replaced. So think about that and ways to prolong and better use the infrastructure we've already got. And my second point of emphasis is, and I've actually got three parts to this, but when we have made fully informed decisions, well-informed decisions that we need to replace the functionality of aging or expiring or failing infrastructure, or we need to construct new infrastructure due to growth or regulatory requirements, then we need to be getting smart about how we do this. And with this, I really encourage you to get the report that Reese has put together and take a look at it, because it goes through these points. And I'm actually just going to emphasize the three that, based on my experience, are the ones that tend to be missed the most. So the first one is that we need to be incorporating smart technologies. So just imagine the devices you have on your person right now, on your body, your Fitbit or your heart monitor, all these devices, wireless technologies out there. The marketing of high technology like this is towards personal use, and it is not really towards utilities, because the thought is that utilities aren't very well positioned to optimize this technology. What we need to do is we need to turn this around, and we need to get our utility infrastructure to better utilize new and smart technologies, because there's valuable insights with the data that becomes available to us, the data and the value of having that data in a timely way so we can make smart decisions. We can even be learning about how to maintain infrastructure in such a way that we can avoid failures and we can be more efficient in how we operate. So there's an awful lot going on out there with sensors and wireless technologies for operations and maintenance, and these technologies should be designed into our new infrastructure as well. So the second piece to this is that I see is unfortunately being missed too much is that we need to turn around our thinking, where we mostly have operated our utilities as monopolies. We need to build a much stronger relationship with our communities, and where we need to start considering our range of solutions to problems much earlier than we typically do, and engage our communities and engage our regional partners. There's something that we're starting to do more and more these days called value planning, where early on in the process we are engaging partners, we're engaging the communities to make sure we're defining the problem properly and looking at all the options out there for solutions. We touched on a few of them, microsystems and decentralized solutions that could be better overall for the community. And with this, we'll be uncovering more opportunities. We'll be finding new solutions. In fact, resiliency is very, very key right now, and it's one of those topics that isn't getting talked about enough, but it's going to start getting talked about much more, and we should really be thinking about resiliency. And what this means is minimizing the impacts of things like climate change, rising sea level, extreme weather, natural disasters, and security threats, so that our communities and systems remain safe and secure. But it also means increasing the capacity of people, of communities, institutions, and businesses to survive and adopt and grow, no matter what sorts of stresses, whether they're chronic or acute shocks to the system. So resiliency is real key, and working with our communities and our regional partners on this is very important. And the last point here that I think is unfortunately being missed too much has to do with how public sector should be looking to alternative contracting approaches and collaborative private sector partnerships. So as you can see possibly from my bio, can't remember if it's actually in there, but we have experience in public sector at partnering with private sector, and I can say there really is a lot more I can say based on my experience of having worked both public and private, that public sector is typically, in most cases, not really setting up their contracting in a way to ensure optimal collaborations with the private sector. For example, they should be setting up competitions for which private sector can compete and find the most innovative, really be searching for the most innovative and cost-effective solutions. There's ways to go about risk sharing such that it doesn't pose any greater risk to the public sector. So I think that there's a whole lot more that can be done to optimize collaborative partnerships for better solutions when we really do figure out that we do need additional infrastructure for one reason or another. So thank you very much, Radhika.
Great. Thank you, Liz, for those great comments on both maintaining the good infrastructure that we have and making smart investments for the future. Next, we have Bobby Cochran, who is the Executive Director for the Willamette Partnership, which is a nonprofit coalition of business, environmental, and other leaders who are working to address conservation problems using approaches that improve outcomes for people and the ecosystems. And Bobby is also a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Culture of Health leader. So welcome, Bobby.
Great, Radhika. Thank you so much. And hi, everybody. Reese, I just wanted to say thank you for the 2040 water report. We're, as Willamette Partnership, we're a conservation organization that does work across the West, and we're organizing a lot of our work around smarter infrastructure tied back to the 2040 vision. And I think a big part of that is the emphasis on multi-benefit projects, the idea being that, we have fewer land, less resources. We need our infrastructure to create multiple benefits. And I think to the extent we can think about water infrastructure as providing benefits for fish and wildlife, providing benefits for human health, providing benefits for public safety, you can start thinking about how you can get multiple investment streams to both fund the planning, the design, the construction, and the maintenance of infrastructures. And there's a couple of examples I just want to share from here in the Pacific Northwest. One is out in Washington County in Oregon, where Clean Water Services has been investing in restoring streams now for the last decade. And there's one stretch of an urbanized creek called Fano Creek that now used to be a park with a straightened stream, turf grass going right down to the edge. Clean Water Services invested in remeandering that stream, restoring it and replanting it. And now 10 years later, you have shade that's providing temperature that Clean Water Services is able to use for their permit compliance, and it saves them tens of millions of dollars. But even more exciting, there's cutthroat trout, river otter, mussels back in that urban stream. So really important habitat benefits. But one of the questions that we asked with Clean Water Services in Portland State is, going back to kind of the history of the water industry, the water industry was founded to protect public health, right? A big part of what the industry does is try and prevent communicable diseases. But that's not our major health challenge in this country right now. Chronic disease is the major driver for healthcare costs. It's the major source of health disparities and health inequities. And so if you take a step back and look at all the things that water utilities are doing that could impact and improve chronic disease, you start thinking differently about some of these actions. So all of those same trees on that 13 miles, we were able to quantify the air pollution reductions and show that you're seeing a 1 to 10% reduction in nitrogen dioxide and PAH exposure, which we could quantify back to reduce chronic respiratory disease and reduce healthcare utilization, starting to make the business case for why a Kaiser Permanente or a healthcare system or a state Medicaid program would actually partner up with a water utility to invest in green infrastructure. And so looking at some of those cases, it's happening in lots of different places, and not just the big utilities. Seattle is asking the question, if I'm going to spend $1 billion on combined sewer overflow, dealing with saltwater intrusion and sea level rise and a number of other issues, how could I actually invest that in a way that maximizes health equity? And if you're thinking about health equity, all of a sudden looking at community leadership and community engagement is not a nice to have. It's actually a key component of creating health. If you look at affordability, that's just not a justice issue. It's actually an important part of creating a culture of health. And it also gets into workforce issues of why it might make sense for water utilities to partner up with affordable housing and urban development. As we've been talking with rural communities, particularly on the coast, utility workers can't afford to live in the communities they're serving. And so how do you kind of create a workforce to meet the needs of sustainable infrastructure, but how do you partner up on affordable housing issues so that you can afford to recruit and retain the people that are going to best provide the value back to the community? So all those questions around multi-benefit investment, we're getting more and more tools to quantify multiple benefits and give both utilities and communities the capacity to optimize for different sets of solutions or values that they're after, and even more so start to think about how might we need to change the State Clean Water Revolving Fund policy or USDA Rural Development Title so we can invest more in multi-benefit water infrastructure projects. So I'll leave it there. We have plenty of time for questions, so if folks want to type in questions, I'm happy to give more. Other folks can give more on each of their talks as they go along. But Radhika, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Bobby, and great point, Bobby. If folks want to be typing in questions in the Q&A box, we have 2 more lightning round respondents, and then we'll get into discussion. So next, I'd like to introduce Judi Gladstone, who is Head of Strategy and Government Affairs for the Seattle Public Utilities Commission, and in that Seattle Public Utilities. And in that capacity, she's responsible for shaping and managing major policy decisions for the drainage and wastewater business. So thank you for joining us, Judi, and I think you're going to share with us some thoughts on utility decision-making and strategy.
Yeah, thank you, Radhika, and thank you to all those who've already spoken before. I think that a lot of what I'm going to say is mirroring and maybe going into a little next level in terms of the value planning that is so important in terms of the projects on the ground. And in order to have effective and efficient solutions that are best for the system, the environment, and the community, here at SPU we really look at, I'd say, 2 primary foundations. One is the collaboration that occurs both internally and externally. Internally, one team is what we call it, where we make sure that all of the different perspectives in the utility are represented early on in the planning, whether it's for a project or planning an overall program, because we want to make sure that we have a clear identification of the problem. It's so important in value planning that you have that problem defined so that you don't end up having solutions in search of a problem. And with the multiple perspectives at the table, it's a more robust conversation that enables us to get there. And so whether it's including the operations, the maintenance, the finance, the politics, all of the different perspectives that make a utility run are represented at the table as we look at the different possible solutions so that we can be thinking outside the box. But that coincides with our external work that we do in terms of engaging with different stakeholders, with different community members. We believe it's really important to collaborate with those community partners because it does produce better system results. And whether or not it's with the low-income housing or if it's with the local environmental groups, we understand and we've seen how those kinds of relationships have led to more robust solution problems and potentially public-private partnerships that make our programs easier to implement and more affordable. So that's the one element that is really important to the value planning. The good collaboration is combined with the utilization of triple bottom line. It underlies the investment strategy. And the way that I look at it is that there's 3 legs to the stool of triple bottom line: the financial, the environmental, and social, and we all hear those. And I think that those 3 different legs we've done throughout our time to varying degrees better than others. So financially, we've been really quite good at over time. And we have done well to incorporate what the costs are, capital operations and maintenance over the lifetime of the investment. The environmental we've worked on over the past years to identify the impacts and be able to quantify them to the extent possible, and evaluate them in that way as well as qualitative. And now what I have been seeing is the social leg of the triple bottom line is really what has been evolving and become much more stronger in our evaluation of projects. It allows us to look at where those multiple benefits are, what the community benefits are, and really evaluate them. And as others have spoken about, being able to look at those in a more quantitative way through a lens that we probably hadn't paid as much attention to in the past. And I think that you put those two things together, and one of our greatest challenges as a utility is to deliver on our core mission affordably and sustainably. And when I say sustainably, I'm talking about both financially and operationally. And this can be especially challenging in the face of uncertainty, whether it's the technology that's uncertain, the financial circumstances, or even the political arena where there are so many uncertainties built into the decision-making that we need to make. But it's important to clearly understand how alternative solutions affect the delivery of our core mission of the utility. And value planning may make it more difficult and more complicated, but providing multiple benefits in a project produce better environmental and equitable infrastructure investments. And using triple bottom line kind of serves as a good tool to inform those decisions so that the system continues to function most efficiently and effectively while providing the greatest value to the community. And through the collaborative work, that approach ensures that the core mission of the utility can be delivered affordably and sustainably and in a way that produces more equitable outcomes as well as more environmentally preferred outcomes. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to you, Radhika.
Great, thank you so much. So we have a couple of questions that are starting to queue up, so I want to encourage folks to ask their questions via the Q&A box while we hear from our last lightning round respondent, Julie Davies O'Shea, who is the Executive Director of the Farmers Conservation Alliance. And in that role, Julie implements the FSA's vision to benefit both agriculture and the environment through innovative programs and technologies for irrigation modernization. So thank you for joining us, Julie.
Hi, well, thank you for having me, and thank you to Reese and the other speakers today for all your thoughts on this. And I'm really excited to get a chance to talk about what we're doing and thinking about irrigation infrastructure in particular, as it's one of the biggest issues facing infrastructure and our communities as a whole. And yet, because irrigation infrastructure is outside of our general population where we live and what we're thinking about, it's one of those issues that kind of disappears into the background. And yet it has the potential for some of the greatest benefits and impact in the Western United States. And to really give you a sense of how big of an issue it is, as we all know, in the summertime, for the most part, we don't get rain out here in the West. And so in order to grow food or raise cattle, we have to divert water from river or lakes. And there is pretty sophisticated irrigation systems throughout the Western United States to do this. However, these systems are now 75 to 125 years old. And when they're moving this water, they're losing 30 to 70% of the water for the most part on most systems from the point of where they're taking it from a river or lake to where they're actually delivering it from an irrigator. And of course that presents multiple challenges, as on the irrigator side, they're moving water and losing it, and you think in a drought year, they're not actually able to deliver the right amount of water to an irrigator on time. Plus you compound that with many of these systems are using pumps and significant electricity to move water from one place to another. So they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars moving water throughout the Western United States. And then on a community and environmental basis, when we have limited water in the stream and a growing population and growing needs for environmental and community purposes, we're having to withdraw more water out of the stream in order to meet the needs of the irrigators. And working on these irrigation systems has really been one of the most exciting projects I've seen at looking how we find this nexus between community benefit and yet productivity. And FCA got its start on this about 13 years ago because of the Farmers Irrigation District in Hood River. Farmers Irrigation District had 13 points of diversion where they were diverting water for both hydropower and for delivery to their farmers. And one of their issues was as they were diverting water, they were getting sticks and fish and leaves stuck in their system. We have a handful of technologies that were approved and allowed for irrigators to use to withdraw the water, but they were on a high gravity system, which are often the systems you see where you have irrigation and hydropower combined. And their systems were constantly getting clogged. And this small irrigation district was spending more than $100,000 a year just maintaining the canals. They were losing hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in hydro revenue. And then the farmers weren't getting water, and they're having all these issues of just water delivery. And so in 1996, a big flood came through and ripped out their irrigation systems or their fish screens. And so to come up with a way to try to eliminate those issues, they partnered with agencies and nonprofits and tribes and spent about 10 years and $2.5 million, and they came up with a fish screen technology that eliminated their debris issues and at the same time provided optimal fish protection. And that's when FCA began, and we got our start because Farmers Irrigation District realized the potential for this technology and the benefit of it. And so they licensed the technology to FCA under a condition we take it to market and then use our profits for other things that benefit both environment and ag. And so we got our start, as I said, more than 10 years ago, and we started traveling throughout the western United States and meeting with irrigators and having conversations about putting fish screens in the ground. And what we quickly learned was here were these irrigators who desperately need a more efficient system, and they want to be able to keep more water in stream and use less power. And they had tons and tons of studies sitting on their desk, but they were struggling from how they can take these studies or these plans and actually turn that into implementation. And just as many of the speakers have spoken about earlier today, looking at all these different benefits, as I was talking about earlier, the multi-benefits of actually modernizing their systems and creating a methodology from moving from plans to actual implementation has really been at the forefront of irrigation infrastructure right now. And working in collaborative partnerships, as we've been hearing, and figuring out how these unique partnerships and funding can be played to put these projects in the ground has been one of the pieces that's been in the last 2 years really coming alive. And so it's exciting to think about the conversations that are happening at both the state and at the national level, and especially with things like with Reese and the Institute and thinking about these studies happening to continue to bring up these conversations about how do we improve infrastructure not only in our urban communities, but in the rural communities as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Appreciate it. So now we're going to turn to questions from the audience, or from the listeners, I guess. So I wanted to begin with one question that's on the importance of public and political will building for all of this to happen, and really how we create strong collaboration between local, state, federal government. So the question is, how can local organizations influence national policies and funding? How is the information most effectively shared and distributed? And what are some of the success stories or lessons learned around how to effectively convince different government levels to coordinate their actions as it relates to water? So a lot of questions in that, a lot of great questions. So any reactions from our presenters?
This is Chuck. I would use as an example both good and bad. The public, the trust fund, Public Works Trust Fund, when you looked at the way it was established, I happened to be at community development, state community development at the time. It was based on getting a partnership between diverse interests from environmentalists to unions to the business community that all saw the need for making investments in the public sector and in infrastructure and providing support for small communities, particularly in being able to do that. So I think that was a real success story when it happened. As everybody knows, when money became critical at the state level, particularly related to education, it's now been one of the failures because it's basically been taken away. But I think if you go back and look at that, and I'd ask kind of Radhika a little bit, because the Alliance is one of the ways nationally that we're trying, that one of the reasons Cascade is interested in working with them, because they have access and involvement at the national level that could be helpful. So maybe Radhika, you could talk about that too.
Yeah, I think, it's our view, and a lot of the work that we're trying to do at the Alliance is really try to advance a inspiring and compelling national narrative around why the critical role that water and wastewater infrastructure and the utilities that operate it are essential to our future. And, what we have found is that there is a tremendous disconnect between where we think that the general public is and where our policymakers are. So we recently issued a national poll a couple weeks ago, and it showed us that infrastructure generally is the top of mind issue for most Americans, and it beat everything from healthcare reform to building a wall to all of the things that are kind of in the public discourse right now. And then when you looked at within infrastructure, water, clean, safe drinking water and wastewater systems was the #1 priority. So we know that the public values water, and I think we have to figure out how we sort of get the public, our policymakers and our politicians to catch up to that. But I want to ask the next question of Judi Gladstone. So one of the listeners asked this question around how do we balance affordability with the sort of fiscal reality of the investments we need to make for sustainability.
Yeah. Thank you, Radhika. I would, before I get into that question, I just want to add one thing to the previous question on a local level. And I can't emphasize enough the importance around building relationships and partnerships with electeds and using the allies that you build, that you develop as a result of the community building that you do to help bring the conversation into a broader arena so that the electeds become more comfortable and knowledgeable in order to make the kinds of decisions that are needed in the utility sector and often fall to a lower priority in a city where there are so many competing needs. And to the current question that you asked, Radhika, in terms of balancing the affordability with fiscal reality, this is one of the biggest challenges. And as we look at different projects and after we've applied all of the triple bottom line analysis, we need to be very careful to look at what the effect is on the rates and on the ratepayers, because in order for us to be clear about our decisions, we may find that there are projects that might be the most cost-effective thing to do, but if we don't have the money in the bank to pay for it, or we don't have the funding capacity, or we don't have the partnerships to help pay for it, then that becomes a problem. And so it does help us to build those bridges to those partners, because that widens the ability of us to be able to expand the projects that we may be doing. And so I think it's a tough one, and it's a matter of looking at not just what's the most cost-effective, but also where does it fit in our priorities, which can be difficult when you have so many competing, but also its impact on rates and the number of opportunities that are out there with the other partnerships, and it certainly motivates us to develop more of those partnerships.
Great, thank you so much. So, we are nearing the end of our time, so I'm going to ask one final question and ask all of our speakers to answer it, maybe in the order of how they spoke. So we have a very powerful vision that has been laid out in this report, And so how do we move from the vision to action that really secures the Pacific Northwest water future? So maybe we could ask you for a 30-second closing thought there, Chuck.
Well, I think the whole issue, it's kind of embedded in every one of the discussions we've had so far, whether it's partnerships, kind of political strategy. But most important is making sure you're asking the right questions within an organization, a utility, a city, a district, or whatever. I think there's a tendency to look at the present and not look to the future. And so I would say this helps us focus a little bit going forward. And if you can open yourself up to thinking outside the box on solutions and really re-examine the things that you're doing, it not only helps deal with things like affordability, but more importantly, helps you really implement a more sustainable utility, a more sustainable city, a more sustainable district, while at the same time, in essence, doing sustainable infrastructure.
Great, thank you. What about you, Liz? Final word?
Right, and it's actually going to touch on a question that Deborah Sherwood asked, and I have to apologize if anybody does not appreciate this, but I'm going to offer this comment from a private sector perspective. Private sector firms, the one I work with currently included, we are always looking for private sector that is wanting to be innovative, wanting to really stretch the limits, wanting to look for super collaborative solutions, wanting to look for international best practice and best solutions. We really do have sustainability and resiliency and social justice as our core values, but it is actually in our best interest from a business perspective to work with those public sector entities that actually want to stretch out a little bit. And so do not underestimate or undervalue what you can get with that. If you're looking to be innovative, there are private sector firms out there that really very much want to partner with you on that journey.
Thank you, Liz. Bobby?
I think for me, we've just got so many fun pieces at play here in Oregon and Washington. I'd love to see us kind of map out what the coalition is needed in terms of, how do we work with, say some of the bigger utilities or associations on funding and flexibility? How do we connect utilities and farmers and environmental groups for, statewide or region-wide funding packages and regulatory flexibility? How do we work with the small and mid-sized communities to really lay out infrastructure, workforce development, and technical assistance kinds of programs? I think there's a lot if we can connect the two states together a little more strongly. So Reese, I'm hoping you can help us do that.
Those are marching orders, Reese. What about you, Judi? Final thought for us?
Yeah, I guess my final thought would be that to start the implementation, to start building the collaboration, to start reaching out to those different stakeholders and even the elected officials and start engaging in that conversation, to be clear on what the vision is and to learn what everybody has to bring to the table to create those robust solutions.
Thank you. And Julie?
Well, I would just add in, I think this is really exciting about this conversation and looking about how we can be learning from different industries and what is happening on infrastructure and how that relates to others. And I would say on the collaborative side of things, one of the big pieces that we see, especially in the rural areas, is we need to create an environment for more conversations to happen, especially when we think about irrigators and farmers, where they're part of the conversation as well, and how we work together to cross language barriers, to cross social barriers, to make sure we're coming up with those solutions that really at the end of the day benefit everybody. So thank you for all this work, Reese.
Thanks, Julie. And then finally, Reese, the leader of this terrific report, Northwest Vision for 2040, tell us what your aspiration is and what you hope to catalyze with this terrific report.
One of the big challenges with this report was to sort of weave together and find the common pathway forward among these multiple perspectives. And all these perspectives were very pragmatic, very important, and I think together we really do have a compelling case to bring the urgency of the water infrastructure challenges from invisible to the forefront and to elevate that conversation. And I think the time is quite urgent. We're looking at a great retirement wave in the water infrastructure sector, and so the need to bring a new generation of workers and planners and managers and leaders into this field is now. And I think we have a tremendous opportunity to be a national and world leader in the Northwest, and the kind of practical, pragmatic, visionary leaders that we have on the call here and that we're engaged in this project are just the kind of people that we need to guide us forward, and I'm very excited for the future.
Great. Thank you, Reese. And I want to encourage folks to go to this Center for Sustainable Infrastructure's website to download the report and read it. It's fabulous. You can also see Reese's contact information there if you want to follow up on anything in the report. And so with that, I want to just again thank CH2M so much for coordinating this webinar and for a really wonderful lineup of visionaries from the Pacific Northwest sharing their insights. So I hope everybody has a wonderful day, and thank you again.
Thanks to all of our participants for joining us today. We hope you found this webcast presentation informative. This concludes our webcast. You may now disconnect. Have a great day.